Reverend King, may we get a little bit of background information on you, please? Were you born here in the South?
Yes, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and I attended school right here, the elementary school. I attended elementary and high school here, and also college. So I spent the first 19 years of my life right here in Atlanta, Georgia.
And your father is a pastor here, is that true?
Yes, he pastors the Ebenezer Baptist Church here in Atlanta.
Did your father influence you in deciding upon the career which you finally chose?
Well, I'm sure there was some influence from my father. It may have been latent in the beginning because in the early days of my college career, I was determined not to go into the ministry. But after being in college 3 years, I think the beginning of my senior year, I decided that I would enter the ministry. There were other influences, but I'm sure that my father served as a great inspiration as well as a great influence.
If you hadn't entered the ministry, what is it that you would have liked to have done?
I started out as a pre-law student. I was interested in going into law. And at one time, I thought about medicine. Now, this was before entering college. Toward the end of high school, I thought of becoming a medical doctor. But then after entering college, I felt that I wanted to go into law, and I guess I spent the first 2 or 3 years taking a pre-med course.
What finally convinced you that you were best suited for the ministry?
I think 2 or 3 things. As I said, I think from the very beginning I had something within, a latent feeling at least, to enter the ministry, and I repressed it as much as possible. But after a while I came to see that it was possible to enter the ministry and still maintain a sort of intellectual respectability. At one point I felt that the ministry was not intellectually respectable. And I think this was because I had met so many ministers who did not have the intellectual discipline that I was concerned about at that time. But I came to see that religion could be emotionally satisfying as well as intellectually respectable. The other thing was that I went to work in Connecticut it must have been 1947 when I was a junior in college, and we had devotional services every Sunday morning, and they insisted on my serving as the devotional leader. So I had the job of leading all of these fellows who were living in the boarding house with me in the devotional service. And I think from this experience, I came to see more and more that I was fitted for the ministry. And when I returned to Atlanta and returned to college, I decided then that probably I could best serve humanity through the ministry. And these experiences conjoined to make me feel that this was an inner urge that I had, which was inescapable, and that the only way to deal with it was to ultimately accept it, which I finally did.
Dr. King, would you say that you led a comfortable existence as a youth in Atlanta? Financially, I mean.
Well, I would say relatively comfortable. We never had any real economic problems. My father has been the pastor of a fairly large church for 30 years now, so that I was just about 2 years old when he became pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And being the pastor of a large church, he was always in a pretty secure economic position, so that I would say that I came up in relatively comfortable conditions. Now, this does not at all mean that we were wealthy at any point, but certainly not poverty-stricken.
Were you aware during this period of the problems that faced a Negro in the South?
Oh, yes. I became aware of these problems first, I believe, when I was about 5 years old. I was raised and grew up on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, and in front of our house was a store, and this store was owned and operated by one of the white citizens of Atlanta. They had 2 or 3 children, and we were about the same age. And when we were 3 and 4, we played together, and this was not an unusual thing. But I never will forget when the day came that my playmates, my inseparable playmates, just found excuses and refused to play with us. And my brother was concerned about this, who was a year young, and I was very much concerned. And then this continued for a week or two, and I started talking with my mother about it. And for the first time, I came to see the problems, because she tried to explain the best way she could to a child just 5 years old the problems which Negroes confronted in the South as a result of the legacy of slavery and then segregation.
It must be a very difficult job for any mother. I wonder if any mother really can explain this to a child, especially a sensitive child.
Well, it's almost impossible to thoroughly explain it. It seems to me that the only thing that the mother can do, the Negro mother, is to try from the beginning to instill in the child a sense of somebodyness. This was what my mother tried to do. She made it very clear that in spite of these conditions, you are as good as anybody else, and you must not feel that you are not. And this was her way of saying you should not have an inferiority complex. Now, this is very difficult because, I mean, even though you say this in words, it's very difficult for the child not to develop unconsciously this sense of inferiority, because he lives every day in the midst of a system which stares him in the face saying you're less than, you're not equal to. And the tendency is to develop this sense of inferiority because of the existence of the system.
Did you develop a sense of inferiority?
Well, I don't think it was ever serious. I'm sure some things worked on my subconscious self, but I don't think I ever felt a conscious sense of inferiority. I always felt from the example and the words that my mother had given all along that I was somebody, and that all Negro people had dignity, even though the system of segregation deprived us of so much.
You went to school in Boston, didn't you, in Boston University?
Yes, I went to graduate school there. I went to college here in Atlanta, and then I went to theological school in Pennsylvania, at Chester, Pennsylvania, Crowser Theological Seminary. And I went to Boston University to do my doctorate.
Did you have an opportunity for remaining in the North after you finished your doctorate?
Yes, I did. When I finished my work at Boston University, 1 or 2 churches in the North, one in New England and one in New York, expressed an interest in calling me to serve as pastor. And then one school in Pennsylvania had offered me a teaching position, so that I would say I had 3 offers to stay in the North after I finished Boston University.
And yet you went to Montgomery, Alabama instead. Why?
That's right. Well, I had a great concern for and commitment to the whole problem of racial injustice, of solving the problem, I should say. I became very concerned about it in my early childhood, and in my teenage days, this problem became a greater concern. And I said from the beginning that in some way I wanted to be a part of solving this problem, so that when I went off to school and faced the temptation of staying in the South, staying in the North, something continued to remind me that the South needed persons to return, and persons who would return and work directly in the field of civil rights to make conditions better, so that I came back with a conscious desire to do something about the problem which existed here.
Did you come back also with a plan of action?
Not any detailed plan of action. When I went to Montgomery, Alabama, I had no particular program worked out that would engulf the total community. I simply thought in terms of making the social gospel a reality wherever I could, and certainly in my own church. The first thing I did at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where I pastored in Montgomery, was to set up a social and political action committee in the church. Now, this committee was to do 2 or 3 things. First, to see that all members were registered voters. Second, to see that all members of the church joined the NAACP and other civil rights organizations that were in the forefront of the struggle. And third, to develop a citizenship awareness within the members, and whenever elections and things like that came up, to seek to educate the members on the issues involved. And I worked through this channel to make the social gospel, as I call it, on the basis of a phrase that has been used over the years, to make the social gospel a reality in the congregation. And then I worked in the community, in the Alabama Council on Human Relations and the NAACP.
Wasn't this conduct a bit unorthodox for a minister?
Well, I think at points it was. There was all too much apathy on the part of the ministry in Montgomery, and I would say all too much apathy on the part of ministers all over. There was the feeling on the part of some that the preacher wasn't to get involved in these social issues, that his job was to preach the gospel. And there were others who considered this working in politics, and they would say that the religion and politics are not to be related at any point. So that they had sometimes conservative views, and at other times there was just a general apathy which grew out of a lack of concern for the problems that many of the people faced.
And you don't agree with that approach?
No, I don't. I feel that any religion which professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not concerned about the slums, let us say, that damn the soul, the economic conditions and the social conditions that cripple the soul, is a dry and really a dead religion which is in need of new blood.
Dr. King, the movement which you have contributed so much to is spoken of as a movement of nonviolent resistance. Where did you get this idea from?
Well, I would say that the spirit of the idea of nonviolent resistance came to me from Jesus Christ. I grew up in the church and always felt moved by and committed to the principles of Jesus Christ from the Sermon on the Mount on through his earthly life. But not only that, I would say that the operational technique came to me from Mohandas K. Gandhi, the great saint of India. I never will forget, when I was a student in theological seminary, I went to hear a speech in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania by Dr. Mordecai Johnson, who at that time was president of Howard University. And he had just returned to the United States from India. He had spent about 2 months there, and so his speech that afternoon was on the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. And I was so captivated by that speech and inspired by it that I went out the next day and bought 4 or 5 books about Gandhi and also his autobiography and started reading them. And after reading these books about Gandhi and the one that he wrote himself, his autobiography, I became convinced that the Gandhian philosophy and the Gandhian method of nonviolent resistance could serve as the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom and human dignity.
Well, how exactly did you intend to apply this method to the American scene?
Well, this is very interesting. I must admit that when I first became inspired by this method and became convinced that it was the most potent method available to the Negro in his struggle in America and to oppressed people generally, I had no particular plan of action. In other words, I was more or less intellectually committed to it. But I did not at that time conceive of the moment when I would start a movement where this method would be the guiding principle and the guiding technique. I would say that this satisfied certain intellectual problems that I had, and at least gave me within my own mind a method and a philosophy which I considered meaningful for social action.
Well, then what was it exactly that made you transform these intellectual ideas into social action? What was the pinpoint, the pinprick?
Well, the occasion was the Montgomery bus boycott, the boycott which took place in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, I had been in Montgomery approximately a year when the boycott started. And, of course, the Negro people came to the point of feeling that they could no longer accept the indignities and the injustices which they had confronted on the city buses. And on December the 1st, 1955, a Negro woman was arrested because she refused to give up her seat for a white passenger, and the word got around the community all over Montgomery, and we had a meeting at my church the next night and discussed ways of dealing with this and protesting such a grave injustice. At that time, we decided that we would have a bus boycott beginning on Monday, December the 5th. And from the very beginning of the boycott, my mind went back, consciously and unconsciously, to the Gandhian technique or the Gandhian principles, because I knew that this was a method constantly used by Gandhi in the struggle in India, and I knew that this was the kind of thing that could guide us through this struggle and bring about an ultimate victory if we adhered vigorously to a nonviolent resistance. Now, in the beginning, I don't believe the name was called. I mean, the name of Mahatma Gandhi. In the early meetings, we talked mainly about Christian love and the principles of Christ as our guide in the struggle. But about a week later, it became necessary to mention the name of Gandhi because we became more and more convinced, at least I did, that we were following the path that Gandhi had followed in India. And so that in mass meeting after mass meeting, the name of Gandhi was used, and it became a part of everybody. I mean, on the lips of all of the people, you could find the word and the name Mahatma Gandhi, so that people who had never heard of Gandhi, many of the unlettered people who had never heard of him, and certainly didn't know anything about his philosophy and his method of social action, came to the point of mentioning his name with a great deal of familiarity.
The Montgomery bus boycott was, of course, successful in the long run. It lasted for quite a long period of time, though, didn't it?
Yes, it did. 381 days, actually. We started out in December of 1955, and it was in December of 1956 before it ended. We committed ourselves to the idea of not returning to the buses until they were integrated, and we did this.
Well, this must have taken a lot of self-restraint on the part of the people who engaged in this bus boycott. Wasn't there any temptation whatsoever to hit back, to fight, not to turn the other cheek, so to speak?
Yes, there were some real difficult moments. There were moments of real temptation when some people almost decided to retaliate with violence. But I can say with a bit of pride for the 50,000 Negro citizens of Montgomery that after the 50,000 Negro citizens of Montgomery, after 381 days of struggle and after facing many threats and many harassing experiences, and after facing actual physical violence, because the violence was inflicted upon several Negroes, after facing all of this, the Negro never retaliated with a single act of violence. So that in spite of the fact that there were moments when some people became angry and there were moments when violence could have erupted, and the Negro could have retaliated with a great deal of violent force, this never happened. It was always blocked in some way.
How do you yourself personally feel about this? You have spoken very often about the power of love, of loving thine enemy. Do you yourself really feel love for the white Southerner who prevents you from riding on a bus with him, or prevents you from eating at a drugstore counter with him, or from going to the same school that his child goes to? Is it really love that you're feeling?
Well, I think so, if one defines love as understanding creative, redemptive goodwill.
The Montgomery bus boycott was followed by the beginning of the sit-in demonstrations. Was there any interrelation there in terms of leadership or in terms of philosophy, or was the sit-in movement itself an accident in the way it began?
I don't think it was an accident. I think the sit-in movement grew out of something that had been developing ever since 1955, when the boycott started in Montgomery. I would put it another way. In 1954, we experienced in the United States a legal turning point as a result of the Supreme Court's decision, which declared segregated public schools unconstitutional, and said in substance that the old Plessy Doctrine of 1896 was no longer relevant or valid, and that to segregate a child on the basis of his race is to deny that child equal protection of the law. Now, this was a legal turning point, but a law can only declare rights. It does not deliver them. And I think what happened as a result of the Montgomery protest was this. We saw the psychological turning point when the people themselves decided to act and give meaning to the law which had been clarified and which had been declared by the Supreme Court's decision, or as a result of the legal turning point. Now, I think the sit-in movement was the next expression of this psychological turning point where the people themselves decided to act, where thousands of students said that we are no longer willing to accept this, and that this is our way of expressing our determination to be free. I think the other difference is this, that it was a regional, a national movement, wherein Montgomery was confined to one community. The sit-in movement moved into many, many states and many, many communities. I think there was a great similarity in philosophy. Both the Montgomery movement and the sit-in movement adhered strongly to the philosophy of nonviolent resistance, so that even though the sit-in started spontaneously, if by spontaneity we mean without a planned pattern on the part of organizations in the forefront of the civil rights struggle, then it started spontaneously. But it didn't start spontaneously if by that we mean it didn't grow out of something. It grew out of the discontent and the disappointment of many Negroes, the evasive schemes and delaying tactics that had developed. And also, I think it grew out of the dignity and the new sense of destiny that came to many Negroes as a result of the Montgomery experience.
Well, this concept of mass action, while not exactly new to American social struggles, nonetheless, in the scale that it has been practiced today, is something new in the struggle for Negro rights. Now, how do you explain the fact that after so many years, now, today, the Negroes in the South should have become so conscious of their power en masse, as opposed to their power solely as individuals to right wrongs, let's say, through the courts or through other individual action?
Well, I think several things account for this. One is the fact that the Supreme Court's decision brought with it a great promise, but it proved to be a sort of blasted hope because of the snail-like pace of the implementation process. And I think that out of this promise and the failure of the promise to come through, many people became discontent, and it became more than an individual discontent, but a collective discontent. And then when the Montgomery movement started, people came to see that the Negro could unite for action and could stand together, because we had always felt, as a result of many things, that we couldn't unite, and forces had existed which sought to conquer by dividing. But Montgomery proved to us that we could unite for action. The other thing was the great struggle in Asia and Africa. I'm sure that the struggle in the United States is just a part of a worldwide struggle for freedom and human dignity. And by noticing people in other countries struggling in mass to achieve their rights, the Negro was inevitably influenced by this. This was true in Asia, through, say, India, for instance, and many countries in Africa, new countries developing. The people, through mass action, were able to do this. So that I am convinced that the struggle in other parts of the world had a great deal of influence in our struggle here in the United States. So these are some of the things, I think, that brought about the mass action. For many years, Negro citizens of Montgomery confronted injustices and indignities on the city buses. For instance, the Negro passenger could not take a seat in certain sections of the bus. The first 10 seats were always reserved for whites only. And no matter how crowded the bus became, or no matter how many Negroes boarded the bus, they could never take a seat in this particular section. This meant that in many instances, Negroes were left standing over empty seats. And on the 1st of December, 19
55, Mrs. Rosa Parks boarded the bus in the downtown section of Montgomery and took a seat. Incidentally, she was not in the section reserved for whites only. She was in the first seat of the unreserved section. And as soon as she took her seat, the bus driver demanded that she give up her seat for a boarding male white passenger. And Mrs. Parks refused to do this. And on her refusal, the bus driver called the police, and they came and arrested her. The word immediately got around the Montgomery community, and as soon as it got around, there was a spontaneous reaction on the part of the Negro community, and this reaction was one in terms of some type of protest. Everybody felt that some protest should take place in order to make it palpably clear that the Negroes did not like this kind of injustice and they could not continue to accept the indignities that they had faced in Montgomery. After the word got around, leaders met on Friday night, which was the next night, and decided definitely that a boycott should be called. It was called for Monday, December the 5th, and on that day, after getting leaflets out all over the cities and after the ministers went through to their pulpits and heartily endorsed the plan, the buses were empty on Monday, and I should say they remained empty for 381 days.
Dr. King, what was your role in the Montgomery boycott? What exactly were your duties? And as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, what did you do during the rest of the boycott?
Well, I was the person who negotiated in all of the negotiation sessions with the bus company and with the city commissioners. I presided in all of the mass meetings, and I was also the chairman of the executive board of the MIA, which means that I had to take care of all of the board meetings. I had to do a great deal in terms of recommending strategy for the whole movement, and in terms of keeping the philosophy of the movement before the people, so that my chief role was that of spokesman, negotiator, and a strategist, as well as trying to give a creative philosophy to guide or to undergird the movement.
Were you ever afraid?
Well, I'm sure there were those moments that I faced rather agonizing fears. We went through many days of threats. There were times that we got as many as 30 or 40 threats a day, threatening calls over the telephone and threatening letters. And I can remember on some occasions that after these threats accumulated, I began to falter and felt some nagging fears. I think on the whole, however, that the fear that inevitably came was somehow removed by being involved in a great movement and being involved in a cause that I knew was right. And the fact that the people were united and together in such a marvelous way did a lot to dispel all of the fears that inevitably came at times.
Was a point ever reached where the Negro community as a whole began to falter? Was there ever any point reached where perhaps the leaders thought that the boycott could not continue?
Oh, yes. We had 2 or 3 instances where we felt that we were at our lowest ebb and that we couldn't go on. But something always happened to give us renewed courage and vigor to carry on. I think of one instance in particular when the city of Montgomery, or rather the city commissioners, went into the state court and sought an injunction against our carpool. Now, we knew that in any state court in Alabama, this injunction would be granted, and it was finally granted, so that our carpool was enjoined, and that meant that we could not provide this transportation system for the people anymore. And we felt then that many of the people would give up and go back to the buses. But the interesting thing is that as soon as the injunction was issued by the city, by the judge in favor of the city, we had a decision from the Supreme Court of the United States declaring bus segregation unconstitutional. And even though the decision did not go into effect until 3 weeks later, the people were willing to hold out, and they did hold out until the end.
What did they do, walk? During those 3 weeks?
Yes, they continued to walk, and of course people continued to pick up other people in their cars. The only thing was it could not be organized from our office or from our organization. This did away with the carpool as set up and organized by the Montgomery Improvement Association, but people still took their neighbors and friends to and from work in spite of the fact that there was no organized carpool.
How did the boycott finally end?
The boycott ended when the buses themselves were finally desegregated. We committed ourselves to the idea of not returning to the buses until they were thoroughly integrated. And after the Supreme Court rendered this decision, the City Commission felt that it could no longer resist. Now, I might say that the boycott itself brought an end, broke down the bus company, broke down the resistance of the bus company. A few days after we started, the bus officials wanted to end segregation almost immediately because they were losing so much money a day. But the City Commission held out, contending that on the basis of the city ordinances and on the basis of state laws, they could not and they would not integrate the buses. And finally, the Supreme Court's decision came declaring bus segregation unconstitutional. And this brought about an end to segregation, and we went back to the buses on an integrated basis.
How did it feel riding the buses that first day on an integrated basis?
Well, it was a great experience. I remember that I had the experience and the opportunity of riding the first bus, and this was a wonderful experience after 381 days of struggling and sacrificing to be able to go back to the buses realizing that they were now integrated. It gave all of us a sense not a victory over the white man, not a victory over particular individuals, but a great sense of victory for justice and for freedom and democracy.
What was Montgomery like after the bus boycott ended? Now, I have heard many stories to the effect that today Montgomery is a city of fear. I mean by that the Negroes of Montgomery are afraid the way they've never been afraid before, and that were a similar incident to happen, you would never be able to get them organized into a mass movement of any sort.
Well, I would not go that far because I went that far before. I never felt that a bus boycott or any powerful, mass, militant, nonviolent movement would take place in a city like Montgomery. I felt that the chain of apathy was so great and firm that it could never be broken, and yet it was, and Montgomery became a great community for social transformation, so that the same thing could happen again. I don't underestimate the fact that there is some fear existing not only in the Negro community, but in the white community. To put it another way, there is a great deal of bitterness in the white community and a great deal of fear in the Negro community. But I feel that you have enough people there who still have the spirit of this movement, enough people who suffered and sacrificed in the bus boycott, that they will never go back to the paralysis of crippling fears that once embrace them. I think that we have enough people in Montgomery who realize that struggle is necessary, that suffering is necessary for freedom, and they will be willing to suffer and do it fearlessly now as well as they did a few years ago.
Well, the thing that bothers me about the fruits of the Montgomery bus boycott is that Montgomery, since then, has been in the news again, and this time as the center of violence directed against the Freedom Riders. Now, one would like to think that a movement of this sort would bring out the best in both the white and the Negro communities, and that this in itself would change the pattern of relationships in Montgomery, but it seems to have done just the opposite.
Well, a nonviolent movement does not work miracles overnight. I think one has to recognize that the initial response of the oppressor when the oppressed people rise up is a response of bitterness. It is a response of resistance. So that no matter if the oppressed rise up violently or non-violently, the response is always the same in the initial stages. I do feel, however, that if one is persistent in his nonviolent commitment, if the group is persistent in its commitment to the method and the philosophy of nonviolence, it eventually gets over to the opponent and does something for his life as well as the life of those who are involved in the movement. I think maybe the first positive effect of a nonviolent movement is what it does to the people who initiate the movement. It gives them a new sense of dignity, a new sense of self-respect, and as a result of this, they finally get over to the opposition. So that I don't think we can expect this kind of movement to work miracles overnight, and I think at points since it started in Montgomery, the bitter feelings are probably greater because Montgomery becomes a symbol of a community trying to resist the new development and the emerging new order with all of the vigor and strength that can be mustered up. But the many gains that have come from the Montgomery movement have come outside of Montgomery, not in Montgomery. I think the great gains came when people all over the country gained a new sense of dignity and destiny. And I think the fact that many cities voluntarily integrated their buses after the Montgomery movement started is indicative of the fact that even though the movement in Montgomery did not change the souls of the people in Montgomery overnight, it did something to people outside of Montgomery and all over the United States.
Well, Dr. King, the next time when you actually became a national figure, I shouldn't say that you were already a national figure, but when you were projected back into the public consciousness in a big way, seems to have been during the last election campaign when you somehow got yourself back in jail for driving in Atlanta without a driver's license or without a Georgia driver's license. Is that true? Is that what happened?
Yes, that's right. I was driving in Georgia. I had moved to Atlanta I think in February of that particular year. That was last year. And I was driving in DeKalb County about 2 months later, and I had not changed my license. I had valid Alabama license, which did not expire until a year later. But I was given a ticket and later fined for driving without a valid Georgia license.
Was that a purely accidental thing, your failure to get the valid Georgia license?
Well, not exactly. First, I didn't know that there was any particular limit, and if there was a limit, I didn't realize that it was a month. I think finally they came. The interesting thing is that at that time there was nothing on the books to reveal how long an individual needed to be in the state before he had to change his license. Now they have made it 1 month, but at that time they didn't have anything specified.
And were you on parole at that time?
Yes. Later I participated in a sit-in demonstration at one of the department stores here when the student movement was moving and going on, and I was arrested in Fulton County, which is the adjoining county to DeKalb County. And after being there about 6 days, I received these papers saying that I was subpoenaed to appear in court in DeKalb County for violating a probation. And when I went, they immediately arrested me in DeKalb County when I was released from Fulton County. And I discovered then what it was. I wasn't even aware of the fact that I was on parole in DeKalb County. I knew that I had paid the fine for $25, but I was not aware of the fact that I was on parole.
So this time they put you back into jail again. And was this the incident in which Mr. Kennedy, now President of the United States, intervened?
Yes. They put me, I was convicted for violating my probation. They placed me in jail in DeKalb County, and then early the next morning I was carried to Kilby, not Kilby, but to the state prison in Reidsville, Georgia. And while there, the Attorney General, the present Attorney General, who at that time was the campaign manager of the president and the president's brother, called the judge in this situation and inquired about the bond, the possibility of my getting a bond, of being bonded out. In the meantime, the president, the present president, who was campaigning to become president of the United States, called my wife and expressed his real concern. And this got out to the press and became a national issue.
Do you feel that the concern expressed by Mr. Kennedy and by Mr. Kennedy's brother, now Attorney General, was a real concern, or do you think that it was somewhat politically motivated in an attempt to reach the Negro voter?
Well, I can't say. It's always difficult when you delve into the realm of human motives. I think there is a possibility that both of these things could have been at work. It's possible. I mean, every now and then, it doesn't happen often, that which is politically expedient is morally sound. And it's possible that Mr. Kennedy could have been concerned about my arrest and at the same time realized that this may be expedient as far as getting the Negro vote. Most politicians do things that are for political expedience. On the other hand, as I've said to some political leaders all along, because the thing is politically expedient, that doesn't mean that it is morally right, because there are times when something is to the advantage of a man politically and at the same time morally justifiable and morally sound. So that I feel that this was a move motivated by political expediency on the one hand. On the other hand, I feel that Mr. Kennedy had a real concern and knew that a great injustice was involved here.
At that time, did you stop to consider that perhaps it would have been better for the movement had you refused the pardon and remained in jail to serve your sentence?
Oh, yes, I thought about that. However, I came to the conclusion that it would have been a mistake for me to refuse signing the bond, going out on bail, for two reasons. First, when I was in Fulton County, I was there for participating in a sit-in. This was a part of my civil rights activities, and I made it clear that I would not accept bail for that I'd stay there 10 years if necessary before I would. And they dropped the charges so that nobody had to sign bond, nobody had to be bonded out. Now, when I was taken to DeKalb County and then down to Reidsville, another question was involved, and that was a simple traffic case. That's all it was. It wasn't a part of civil rights. It was an injustice involved, but not a part of civil rights. And I felt that it would be a mistake to use this, which was not really connected with my civil rights endeavors, and stay in after it was possible to be bailed out. In the second place, I felt that if I did this, many people would interpret this as my attempt to become a martyr, and they would have interpreted this as a publicity stunt on my part. Now, I don't mind people accusing me, anybody in this movement, for engaging in a publicity stunt, when I know that it is something that will involve the movement directly, and is something that is deeply involved in carrying out the ultimate, or bringing into being the ultimate goals of the civil rights movement. But when it's something else, a minor traffic case, then I don't think it's important enough to live with such an accusation.
Has there been any sentiment expressed on the part of any of the Negro members of the movement that you really haven't practiced what you preached, in the sense that you haven't spent that much time in jail, you haven't spent that much time in sit-ins, that much time on the picket lines, that much time boycotting?
Well, I'm pretty sure there would be some, not only Negroes, I imagine there's some whites who would say that. I don't think any leader of a movement, one involved in a movement, ever goes through that movement without confronting criticisms and having questions raised. I have never considered this a valid question, however, because I lived with the Montgomery movement for the whole period, which was a strenuous movement for 381 days, as I mentioned earlier. After the Montgomery movement, I participated in many other direct action movements. I have spent some time picketing when I could, but the responsibilities have been so many-sided and so great to keep the movement going financially and to keep it going otherwise that I haven't been able to do as much as some other people. On the question of jail, I haven't spent a long time in jail because the jailers and the officials would never allow this in many instances. When I went to jail in Atlanta, here in Fulton County, I made it very clear that I was going to stay until to serve all of the time. And I meant that. If it had taken 2 or 3 or 4 years, this was that existential moment in which I felt that the whole existence of my whole existence was involved in my commitment to this movement. And when they dropped the charges after 6 or 7 days, and naturally I couldn't stay. There were no charges there, and that was that. So that I don't think this is a valid accusation if it has been made.
Well, do you plan, or are you hoping to be able to plan in the future to participate in some of the more direct action aspects of the movement, to be on picket lines and to go to jail if necessary? Or do you see your future as being primarily directed towards giving lectures and speeches and retaining and keeping the status, the symbolic status that you already have?
Well, I think it will take some of both. I think the movement is, on the one hand, a job or a matter of interpretation, so that this means that it is necessary to give lectures and speeches at times. I think, on the other hand, the movement must be embodied in an expression on the part of the person involved. I think the movement involves the word being made flesh and dwelling among all of those who seek to interpret and look at the movement, so that I can conceive of the time, if necessary, that I will participate in direct action and take whatever consequences come. I don't believe in direct action for direct action's sake. I think direct action must always be seen as a means and never as an end. I've said this over and over again to students and to groups involved in direct action.
Isn't this one of the problems of the civil rights movement in the South today? That at this moment, at least in Atlanta, progress is being made by negotiations. the need for direct action, at least at this point, does not seem to be as great or as urgent as, let's say, it was in Montgomery, and that this may tend to disperse the elements of the Negro and white population which banded together and created such fertile soil for the breaking down of the segregation barriers, when there was something that they could do in terms of action, such as picketing. Now, when everything goes on behind the scenes, doesn't this, in a way, tend to destroy the solidarity of the movement?
Well, I don't think I think I would have to graciously disagree with the idea that there is no need for direct action. I think there is a very, very strong and basic need for direct action at this moment in the South. I think there may be situations where it isn't needed as much as others, but I think it is greatly needed in Mississippi. It is greatly needed in Alabama. It is greatly needed in South Carolina. In these states, you haven't had any movement. You haven't had any compliance with the Supreme Court's decision. I think there are areas, even in the most liberal and progressive communities, where we need direct action. I think there's a need for direct action in a city as progressive as Atlanta, Georgia. And this is a rather progressive community, but I think there are areas where we will have to have direct action if the powers that be, if the power structure fails to give in, fails to change the situation voluntarily.
Do you feel, Dr. King, that you have the same ties with the Atlanta community that you had with the Montgomery community?
No, not exactly. Well, I was born in Atlanta, and that gives a tie of home. But in Montgomery, I lived with the people in a movement that extended over a year, to more than a year. And we suffered together. We agonized together. We were frustrated together. We felt moments of victory together. So that we went through these great moments together, and by going through these moments, I naturally felt a relationship and a oneness and a unity that I haven't felt in Atlanta, because I haven't been in the same situation. But in Atlanta, I feel I feel a certain closeness with the people, because it's home for me, and I have known it since I was born. But I think that's the difference, that in Montgomery I lived with a movement. In Atlanta, I haven't had the same connection with the community.
Just one last personal question, actually. Are there ever any moments when you sit back and say to yourself, is this all happening to me? When you kind of feel a self-doubt or a doubt about the realism of the situation? When you ever stop to wonder that, after all, you are 32 years old, and this is a tremendous load for one young man to carry?
Oh yes, those moments come. They inevitably come, and I guess it's impossible for one to live through the kind of frustrating moments and temporary setbacks that you face in a movement like this without having moments of doubt.
Mm-hmm. Dr. King, are there any times when you feel doubt about your position, when you feel that here you are, a young man of 32 with tremendous burdens, and you stop and think to yourself, well, can this really be happening to me?
Yes, there are those moments, I'm sure. I have lived with this thing for these years, and I have gone through the moments when I even raise the question, is it worth it? I have gone through the moments of feeling that the frustrations of such a movement are so great that one can hardly live with them. But in spite of all of this, I always come back to the point of believing firmly that this movement is so right, and it is based on such noble moral principles, that the temporary frustrations that come to me as a person are not really important. And one cannot live with anything this momentous and this powerful and as packed with emotional content as the struggle to free a nation of racial injustice and racial prejudice without having difficult and frustrating moments and temporary setbacks. But I think, as one great thinker said, that if one devotes his life to humanity, no temporary setback can overwhelm him, and no burden can discourage him. And so I think that the thing that has sustained me, in spite of all that has happened, in spite of all of the difficulties, is the belief that this is something for the upbuilding of humanity.
May I just interject one other question here? Do you feel a personal sense of destiny in all of this?
Well, I find it very difficult to feel any personal sense of destiny. I find it very difficult to feel that I'm a special person. I would rather think that I am caught up in a movement that is bigger than any one person. I would rather feel that I was catapulted into a position that somebody else could have been catapulted into. It seems to me that time was ready for the kind of movement that took place in Montgomery, which was the real psychological turning point. Just as in 1954 you had the legal turning point in the civil rights struggle, and Thurgood Marshall became a symbol of this, but there were many other forces that led to this legal turning point. In 1955, on the 5th of December, the psychological turning point came when the people themselves began to act and bring into being, act on the basis of the decision that had been rendered. Many forces brought this psychological turning point about, and no one person, whether it be Martin Luther King or anybody else, could be called the causal personality for this psychological turning point. So that if one feels a sense of destiny, he must always feel that this sense of destiny grew out of a historical situation and the fact that time was ready for this creative movement to unfold in this particular community, and a community that many of us felt that it would never take place in.
The Negro people in the South have an understanding of the African situation and feel a kind of basic attachment towards these new countries in Africa.
Yes, I think so. I think this has become increasingly true over the last decade. I don't think the Negro people of the South or the United States generally had an understanding of Africa and a feeling of attachment to Africa, say 20 years ago or 25 years ago, or as late as 12 years ago. There was a feeling on the part of many Negroes of Africa being a backward continent, and because of slavery and other things, many Negroes felt that Africa reminded them of a heritage of oppression, so that there wasn't this feeling of identity. But in the last few years, we have seen something very amazing, and that is a new sense of identity with Africa, and many of the leaders of the new nations of Africa are real heroes to the Negro people, particularly to students on college campuses in the South.
Well, this identity with Africa has also occurred in the North as well, but it has taken different forms. It's taken what some of the northern leaders of the nationalist movement would say are more militant forms. How do you feel about some of the Negro nationalist movements that seem to have sprung up, especially in New York?
Well, I disagree with the underlying philosophy of these movements. I have made it palpably clear on numerous occasions that, to my mind, black supremacy is as dangerous as white supremacy. And I don't think we will ever solve this problem by trying to rise from a position of disadvantage to one of advantage, thus subverting justice. We should not seek to substitute one tyranny for another. On the other hand, it's one thing to disagree with the philosophers, I do, but I think we must understand that these movements just didn't spring into being, didn't come into being out of nothing. Something brought them into being, and they are symptomatic of the discontent, of the restlessness, of the frustration of many Negro people. And I think the way to deal with the nationalist movements is not only to condemn the philosophy, but to get rid of the conditions that they thrive on. As long as you have discrimination, racial discrimination, as long as Negroes are the first fired and the last hired, as long as Negroes confront economic insecurity as a result of employment discrimination, and as long as a Negro confronts housing discrimination, as he does in the North as well as the South, you will have some response like this. So that I think these nationalist movements are indicative of the fact that the Negro is discontent and as a result of discrimination and segregation, and that the federal government as well as people of goodwill must rise up vigorously and forthrightly to get rid of these unjust conditions.
Well, how exactly would you describe the goals of your movement, of the sit-in movement, of the Freedom Riders, of the nonviolent resistance people, as opposed to the goals of the Negro nationalists in the North?
Well, first I would say that the nationalists believe in racial separation. Because of this frustration, they feel that the white man is beyond redemption, and they have many phrases that they use condemning the white man, and so they go to the other extreme of saying that the problem cannot be solved within. The only way it can be solved is to separate oneself from the situation, so that they talk in terms of racial separation rather than racial integration. The goals of our movement, and when I say that, I'm speaking of the sit-in movement, the nonviolent movement generally, as well as the movement which is represented by all the organizations in the forefront of the civil rights struggle, like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Congress on Racial Equality, and my own organization, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Our goal is one of achieving complete integration in American life. Now, we know that before you can have complete integration, you've got to have desegregation. But even after desegregation, which is merely a way of bringing people together physically, to put it another way, which is a way of breaking down the legal barriers and getting rid of the signs and the system, the external system, there will be the necessity of achieving genuine intergroup, interpersonal relations where people have a sense of mutual acceptance, and this is true integration, and this is our ultimate goal. And we feel that through working in a nonviolent manner, we will not only achieve desegregation, which is a necessary step toward integration, but we will achieve actual integration, which will bring men and women together, not merely because the law says it, but because it is natural and right.
Well, is integration, for example, in bus depots and restaurants, etc., is that really the core of the problem? What about the vote? What about the economic inequality that exists between the Negro worker and the white worker? What is your movement doing about that?
Well, I think all of these things are important, and we are working in all of these areas. We work in the area of direct action to break down the system of segregation, and we also work in direct action to break down many of the more subtle problems and barriers that we confront. Now, the voting issue is very important, it seems to me. I am convinced that one of the most important steps that the Negro can take is that short walk to the voting booth. And I think one of the most important steps that the federal government can take is to assure the Negro the right and the protection as he moves toward the voting booth. This is one of the ways that, and one of the main ways, that we will be able to get the proper leaders in office and the proper political leaders that work in the South so that the transition from a segregated to a desegregated society will be much smoother. Now, in many areas in the South, we face not only the problem of the apathy of people, and this is a general problem that not only faces the Negro, but American people as a whole, this problem of apathy. But we face a problem of external resistance where many Negroes, as the Civil Rights Commission reported in its report a few days ago to the President, that there are at least 100 counties in 8 states of the South where Negroes are intimidated and harassed and actually denied the right to vote. And we feel that this is such a big job that we must work in these areas through direct action, and I think more and more the method of nonviolent direct action must be used in the area of voter registration. If we use it in the form of stand-ins, some other method, but it must be used in order to double the number of Negro registered voters. And I think the same thing, the same kind of pressure must be placed on the federal government to assure job privileges and rights to Negroes and thereby bringing about the type of economic security needed. For there's still a great gulf, as you said, and if the federal government vigorously enforces laws already existing, and if it refuses to put government money in plants and in agencies and in situations where discrimination is a glaring reality, even a subtle reality, I think many of these problems will be solved.
Well, it seems to me that there's a bit of a paradox here, too. You claim that your goal is complete integration, yet on the other hand, whenever you organize into a power group, whether this organization is based on race or economic interests, such as trade unions, it seems that you automatically separate yourself from the group that you claim you're trying to integrate with. Now, doesn't this present a problem to you and to your organization?
No, it doesn't, because our organization does not advocate at any point having a purely Negro struggle. We make it very clear that our doors are open to all people who will join us as allies, and I would never like to see the struggle degenerate to a struggle between 2 racial groups, but a struggle between justice and injustice, for this is a real tension, not between Negroes and whites, but between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And we make it very clear that we welcome whites in our ranks and in our organization. The same thing is true of CORE, Congress on Racial Equality. The same thing is true of the NAACP, so that many of the officers of the NAACP are white. And we do not separate ourselves from the group, but we organize ourselves on the basis of conscience, and so we enlist consciences and not only Negroes. Now, it so happens that an organization which is predominantly Southern, as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, you just can't find many white people who would join. This is as a result. This is a result of the fear of social, political, and economic reprisals on the part of whites in the South, so that they are afraid to join. But we do have persons from the North who have come and they have joined in our action programs, making it clear that we are not seeking to separate ourselves from those that we are seeking to become integrated with, but that we are really seeking to enlist all of the people who will join in the struggle to get rid of a system that debilitates a white man as well as a Negro.
Well, when you say your appeal is an appeal to conscience and your approach is an approach to conscience, it seems to me that this presupposes a certain degree of civilization, or let's say civilized attitudes on the part of your opponents. Do you really feel that this is the general state of people in the South today?
Well, I think on the whole, the white people in the South have a sense of conscience, and I think a real sense of guilt about this system of segregation. Many times they act as they act, even the violent forces, because they have a sense of guilt. A guilt feeling can bring about two responses. One response is to repent, to become sorry, and to seek to change. The other response is to attempt to drown the guilt feeling by engaging more in the guilt-evoking act. And I think many people in the white South who go to the extreme of using violence and nasty words and all of these things about Negroes are really seeking to drown a deep sense of guilt by engaging more in the very act which brought the guilt about. So that I think these people have conscience, and even though it is terribly scarred and sometimes asleep, I think it is there. And it is our responsibility to seek to arouse a dozing conscience. Now, this isn't easy, and it can't happen overnight in some instances. And these people have been taught many of these things. They have lived with the system. They are children of that culture. But deep down within, I think within most of the people in the South, there is something that can be appealed to. Now, I must say that there's another side to this. When we talk about appealing to the conscience, it doesn't mean that you will appeal to every white person in Mississippi or in Alabama or in Georgia. Many of the people will never be moved by Negroes or white people of goodwill who join them staying in jail rather than accepting bail. They will never be moved maybe by a Negro's willingness to accept suffering without retaliation. But I think these things do somehow arouse the conscience of many of the people in Washington, let us say, many of the people in the North, many of the people in other areas. And even if they aren't concerned about it, if these people are aroused, they will do more on the level of the federal government to rectify the conditions. I think the freedom rides did arouse the conscience, and they are arousing the conscience of people in Washington. I think the sit-ins did the same thing, people all over this country. And consequently, many cities in the Deep South have opened their lunch counters voluntarily without a single court suit. More than 155 cities have opened their lunch counters.
Yet the freedom rides have also evoked considerable sentiments, and this is also true among the so-called Northern liberals, considerable sentiments of fear. Now, there was not the same kind of unanimous praise for the freedom riders as there was for the sit-in strikers. Now, how do you explain that?
Well, I think two or three things account for that. The freedom rides were a little more controversial. They brought about a greater possibility of physical violence being inflicted on those who were participating in the movement. And whenever you get a great deal of violence coming out, there's always a danger that people will use this tortuous logic of making the robbed as responsible as the robber. And I think this happened, that when all of the violence broke out, even though the Freedom Riders never retaliated, they tended to see this as creating trouble and as something that was inherently violent. I think another thing is this. Many people have just come to the point of seeing that this struggle must be a national struggle and not a sectional struggle. Consequently, when they saw people coming down from the north joining the movement, they didn't sympathize as much. When they saw the sit-in movement, that was basically an indigenous movement. The participants lived in the South, in the section of the country where it started. When with the Freedom Rides, many of the people came from other sections of the country. And I think we've got to grow to the point of seeing that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so that if a problem of discrimination exists in Alabama, it should be the concern of people in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and Philadelphia and all over the country. But I don't think people had come to the point of seeing this. The other thing is, when the Attorney General of the United States called for a cooling off period and said that this may embarrass the president, I'm sure that this caused many people who were at that point pretty sympathetic to turn a little bit. It shows the power of the words from key figures in the government and the words of people who are the policymakers of the nation. I'm sure that turned a great deal of public sentiment against the Freedom Ride movement.
Do you think that some of the black nationalist movements in New York might actually endanger the cause for which you are fighting by forcing the liberal, who might otherwise be in sympathy with you, to become frightened of excesses?
Well, it seems to me that it may do the other thing. It may be the very opposite result. These movements, these nationalist movements, should say to everybody that we'd better wake up and solve this problem and solve it soon. Because if we don't, this is the kind of thing that will develop. I think also this development, this nationalist development, should say to the white liberals that the nonviolent direct action movement is a moderating influence in the Negro community, and it should cause the people of goodwill to give more active support than they have given to the nonviolent movements in the Negro community. So that instead of causing many people to resist and say that the whole movement will lead to excesses, it seems to me that the nationalist movements may very well cause many people to see that we had better do more than we've done in the past to get rid of the problem of racial discrimination.
Your movement here in the South has been called by many a middle-class movement, oriented towards the middle-class point of view and participated in primarily by the middle class. Is this true?
No, I don't think so. I think this movement, one of the very interesting things, and I would say the amazing thing about it, is that it is a movement that brings the classes and the masses together, so to speak. In Montgomery, Alabama, figuratively speaking, the no-Ds and the PhDs came together. We didn't have just people with college degrees or people with economic security in the movement, nor did we have just untutored, unlettered people in the movement, but all people came together. And I think Montgomery was certainly a refutation of the idea that this is merely a middle-class movement. And even though the student movement would be middle class in the sense that students are usually middle class. If we think of the middle class as some sociologists would, as determined by educational standards as well as economic standards, then they would be considered a part of the middle class. But these students have been supported throughout by adults, and they have been supported by the masses of people in every community. So that I don't think this is a middle-class movement. I think it is a movement of the people, of all levels and of all classes.
Well, in the North, of course, the problem is quite different. The Northern Negro already has many of the freedoms which the Negro in the South is still fighting for. Now, how would you suggest that the Northern Negro meet the problems that he is still faced with? Obviously, sit-ins aren't going to help him because he can get service at most lunch counters. What would be the program or the plan of action for the Northern Negro?
Well, it depends on the situation. I think there are points at which nonviolent demonstrations can be very helpful in the South. In the North, to call attention to the problems which exist. Let's take the problem of housing discrimination, which is certainly one of the big problems in the North. In order to creatively dramatize this issue, maybe some kind of stand-ins and sit-ins will be necessary in housing units or around housing divisions and communities in residential areas that exclude Negroes. Also, all of the states should have laws prohibiting property owners and agencies that carry on I think I should all definitely mention real estate agencies from practicing perpetuating housing discrimination, so that every state should have a law which makes housing discrimination illegal. And I think that one of the ways this can be done is to put pressure on state governments, on the legislative councils of the states. And this can be done often by nonviolent demonstrations, so that there are points where this method can work. Also, the legislative, the legal aspect is still there. Many things must be done through the courts. And another thing is the need to constantly keep the federal government reminded of its responsibility. For if there is to be an end to economic discrimination, the federal government must play a big role in ending it. We can think of the fact, for instance, that billions of dollars are spent every year by the federal government in government contracts. Now, if the government ever becomes firm about this matter and makes it clear that no company, no industry, no agency can receive federal funds or can receive government contracts without being very clear and specific about removing all conditions of discrimination, I'm sure these things would end. The same thing is true in housing. Most of the housing falls under the category of the federal government, either FHA or PHA or urban renewal of veterans loans. 90% of the housing in the United States somehow has been touched by the federal government. Now, if ever an executive order comes down making it clear that the federal government will not finance any housing that is discriminated, that has any discrimination involved, I think that would end housing discrimination. So that in the North, it seems to me that the job is to use direct action when possible and feasible, also to use court action when possible and feasible, and then to continue to put pressure on the federal government.
Do you think that Northern Negro leadership is militant or conscious enough or interested enough in fighting in an activist fashion in order for this program of pressure to succeed?
I think so. I think this has become increasingly true. Now, I wouldn't say that it has always been true. You've always had some solo voices crying out for freedom for the Negro in the North, and aware of the fact that discrimination existed there. But now I think what we see is this solo voice being transformed into a large chorus crying out for freedom and human dignity for the Negro all over America. For instance, the support that the Northern Negroes have given to the Southern struggle reveals a new sense of, a new awareness, I should say. And I think that what has happened in the South has given the Northern Negro a new sense of dignity and a new determination to struggle, and a new awareness of the fact that things are not altogether solved. All of the problems are not solved there, so that I think we're getting more and more vigorous leadership in northern communities from Negroes.
What do you think is the basic cause, if there is any basic cause, for the continuing status that the Negro is forced into, a status of inferiority by the Southern white and by some communities in the North?
I think it can be explained first by the long night of slavery, which gave many people the attitude that the Negro was less than human. We still have some of the effects of slavery. We're still living with it. Secondly, I think we must see the economic factor here. What the white South is seeking to defend, probably more than anything else, is a preferred economic position, and to perpetuate a system of human values that came into being under the slave plantation system, and which cannot survive in a day of democratic equalitarianism. I think this is one of the main reasons for the continued existence of segregation. Also, a sense of social status that comes as a result of this sense of economic power, maintaining a preferred economic position. So that I think all of these things must be mentioned, and they're certainly a part of the causal basis for the continued existence of the system. And then when you think of the fears that naturally developed as a result of this and the guilt feelings, then the problem is increased. There is the fear in the South and in some parts of the North of intermarriage, for instance. Now, this fear has grown out of many things. Upon its sense of fear, and this sense of fear has grown out of a sense of guilt and a fear of retaliation, so that you go into the psychological parts of this problem. And I think when you bring together the psychological, the economic, and the fact that the Negro was a slave, and consequently he was thought of as a thing and as something to be used as property rather than a person to be respected. I think all of these things explain to us why we still have this system.
Would you say that your concept of civil disobedience is appropriate to other situations as well as the situation of the Negro struggling for equal rights in the United States? For example, when young people refuse to take shelter during air raid drills, for example, they too are using this technique of civil disobedience, of sitting down against what they consider an unjust law, just as you refuse to obey the laws that provide for discrimination in the South. Would you take the same position with regard to such instances of civil disobedience for the sake of conscience?
Very definitely. I think this approach is applicable in other areas, and I'm convinced that it must be used more and more to arouse the conscience of the world on this whole question of war and peace. We are moving more and more toward annihilation, and I'm convinced that if somehow the nations of the world are not driven to the point of reevaluating their sense of values and driven to the point of suspending nuclear tests and disarming, we will be plunged into the abyss of annihilation. And we do need people who will practice civil disobedience in order to do this. Just as Bertrand Russell does it in England, we need more and more people to do it in the United States.
Thank you very much, Dr. King.
The Vietnam War is terribly important to all of the programs that are being presented now in order to relieve the poverty of the ghettos. Do you feel that the Negro populations of the various cities in this country understand the Vietnam War? Do you think that they're for it, opposed to it? Do you think they have any concept of its relationship to their welfare?
Well, I think more and more the Negro populations, the Negro community, I should say, is becoming aware of the war in Vietnam as a factor in many of the domestic situations that we confront today. Here again, this is a matter of education, of arousing awareness, and most people go along with the war in Vietnam because they don't know the issues involved, they don't know the history of the conflict, they don't even know how the war itself is serving to play havoc with our domestic destinies. Once this awareness comes, you get a response that is basically one opposed to the escalation of this war. Now, I think we're seeing more of this in the Negro community because even in the civil rights movement, some of us have been willing to come out against the war in Vietnam, even though some of the civil rights organizations have refused to do this. Some have come out, and the more this happens, the more people will begin to raise questions. We hear talk about guns and butter, but when people come to see that there is more concern about guns than butter, they are going to be opposed to that war. And I think people are coming to see in the Negro community that the country seems to be more concerned about its military outpourings than about solving problems here at home. And I think the other thing that we must recognize at this point is the Negroes are coming to see the disproportionate number of Negroes in Vietnam, and particularly in the combat troops, which means a disproportionate number of deaths coming to the Negro community. All of these things, I think, will continue to instill an awareness and a concern in the Negro community, which will lead to opposition to the war in Vietnam.
Might it not be too late? I mean, you're now counting on political education, yet this is happening in the here and now, and I don't hear the voice of the Negro leadership raised in any real protest against the war. I don't hear this question of the disproportionate number of Negroes being discussed outside of a few of the top count. You know, every so often you'll hear that there's been a press release or someone has said something, but it's not in an organized fashion. It's not in an emotional fashion designed to arouse people. I mean, how do you expect this to be accomplished under these circumstances?
Well, this is not a programmatic action at this point in the civil rights movement or outside the civil rights movement. I guess everybody feels that there is a real dilemma here. On the one hand, you're battling to get rid of discrimination and segregation and racial injustice generally, and you do have to raise the question of whether you have the tools, whether you have the energy, whether you have the hand, so to speak, to relate the peace issue to the civil rights issue from an organizational point of view. But from a content point of view, the two issues cannot be separated. There can be no peace without justice. There can be no justice without peace. And I think more and more we will get Negro leaders at least showing from a content point of view that these two issues cannot be separated. Whether we will get to the point of having programmatic action in the civil rights movement on the war in Vietnam is another question. I think this is going to be very difficult because of limited facilities, above all limited staff, and I think greater than all of this is limited energy.
Dr. King, last December, in an interview with me, you indicated that you felt the civil rights movement was not yet prepared to go into the peace field, both from a practical organizational point of view, and also you felt that the desire was not there. What has happened in the last 2 or 3 months to change the focus attention of the civil rights movement, and in particular of yourself?
I've come to see over the last few months that the war in Vietnam is seriously diverting attention from the civil rights movement and from the programs that will go a long, long way toward rectifying many of the ills that Negroes in the United States confront as a result of many years of deprivation and as a result of the long night of slavery and racial segregation. I think of the poverty program as a very practical example. This was a program that heralded glowing days of compassion and concern, and really glowing days of getting rid of the conditions that made for poverty. But as a result of the war in Vietnam, we find ourselves in the position of not really being able to solve the problem of poverty because so many of our resources are turned toward the war. And I feel that the great society is being shot down every day on the battlefields of Vietnam, and that this war is playing havoc with our domestic destinies. But even beyond that, I feel that the war in Vietnam is wrong. It's morally wrong, even on the old concept of a just war. This particular war does not meet the qualifications. And for this reason, I feel that I must stand up against it.
Dr. King, what you have just expressed, you have expressed it before. The question really is, what has made you decide to become an activist in the peace movement at this particular point? You have always expressed the position that you were opposed to the Vietnam War. This is understood. But you have not, until this time, taken a direct role in the peace movement.
Well, the answer to the question why I've decided to become an activist in the peace movement, the whole quest for peace, grows out of the fact that I see that there's no real move on the part of our government to end this war. We are guided on the one hand by the idea that we can have a military victory in Vietnam, and on the other hand by a paranoid anti-communism, a paranoid fear of communism. Consequently, our course of action, I should say our government's course of action, will from this day on be one of escalation rather than de-escalation until the forces of goodwill and concern bring these issues out in the forefront. It was my hope that our government would de-escalate, that we would at least bring about a cessation of the bombings of the North and create the climate for negotiation. But the fact that we have not done this, and the fact that we have, on the other hand, increased our military involvement in Vietnam, caused me to see that it was time now, more than ever before, to really take a stand against this war. So my stand at this point, and my activism at this point, grows out of the fact that we have been terribly lax in creating the climate for a negotiated settlement for a conflict that I consider a very tragic one, and one that can destroy the whole world if we are not eternally vigilant.
Dr. King, do you think your participation in the peace movement will have an effect on the success of the peace movement in terms of reaching a great many Americans, young as well as old?
Well, it's hard to say. I would certainly hope that my participation will reach many people, because I think now is the time to have numbers. We are still in a situation where numerical support for a particular idea serves as a powerful lever for social change. And if you don't have the numbers, people tend to ignore you. So I would hope that my activity in this area
will attract persons who have not been attracted before, and will bring about a massive outpouring on the part of the Negro community of America, because I don't think Negroes have been as active in protesting the war in Vietnam as we should be. The Negro happens to be the chief sufferer from a numerical point of view in this war, and for this reason I feel that the Negro should be the chief protester.
What are you planning to do outside of organizing mass demonstrations, which in the past have not proven too successful?
I think at this point we've got to be concerned about effectiveness. Demonstrations for the sake of demonstrations will not do the job. I think now demonstrations must be geared toward a real impact on the power structure of our nation. And this is not a criticism of past activities, because I think they did a great deal to expose the evils, dramatize the injustices of this war, and bring the whole issue out in the open. But I think we are now at a stage where we must be very effective. And I would hope that as a result of my concern and that of others, that we will be able to bring large numbers of young people and adults to the point of saying in no uncertain terms that this war is wrong, and they are willing to engage in action programs to express their discontent and their outrage at such a very unrealistic and immoral policy on the part of our government.
Dr. King, you have indicated that you feel young men should refuse to serve in the armed forces as conscientious objectors if they are opposed to the war. Do you think that it is within the realm of possibility to organize enough of these young men in order to have an effect on the government of the United States in terms of either turning in their draft cards, burning their draft cards, or doing something in an effective show of opposition to the war?
I think that we've got to think about strategies and tactics that will bring the great majority to the point of protesting the war, but beyond that, tactics that will bring the great majority to the point of feeling that they can participate. Now, in this sense, I feel that young people have a great role to play, and adults have a great role to play in supporting them. I think that we've got to see conscientious objection for what it is, and that is an act on the part of an individual who, on the basis of conscience, cannot engage in the killing process, which is so much a part of the violent moves on the part of particular civilizations. And I feel that it is very necessary to mobilize the young people of our nation to the point of saying that war in general is wrong, but that this particular war is definitely wrong.
Well, your definition of conscientious objection would seem to me to include precisely the latter, namely those who do not necessarily feel they are pacifists, but who feel that this particular war is wrong. Now, this is not a definition of conscientious objection that has been accepted either by the government or by the courts of this country. Do you not put yourself in a position of authorizing the violation of law and then in a position of going to jail because you are, in fact, telling these young people that they may validly violate the law?
Well, I would say to that there comes a time when a wrong is so huge, an evil is so massive, so gigantic, that you suffer the consequences of your protest. I think that's true in the Vietnamese War. I think that it is so wrong, it is so unjust, it is so immoral that people of goodwill must take a stand against it, and they must engage in direct action programs against it, and even civil disobedience, and suffer the consequences. Now, on the question of the illegality of advices that I have given, I would simply say that a law is often interpreted and it is often checked on the basis of breaking it. That's the only way that you test the constitutionality of it or the legality of it. And it is my deep feeling that the draft laws must be changed and the Selective Service Act must be changed. I think people must have a right to oppose a particular war, even though they are not pacifists and even though they will not oppose war in general. Now, I happen to be a pacifist, and I oppose violence. I can oppose the killing of anybody. I don't plan to kill anybody in Mississippi, nor will I do it in Vietnam, nor will I do it in Latin America, any other place in the world. But that's a particular conviction on my part. I think we've got to see that many people oppose this particular war, and we should have constitutional provisions for these persons so that they can choose alternative alternative services outside of the military where they can serve their country, reveal their patriotism, but not engage in the killing process.
The Supreme Court, however, has already given an answer to your contention. They have refused to review the case of a young man who argued that he ought not to serve because the war was illegal and immoral and in violation of international morality agreements and treaties. Now, by refusing to review the decisions of the lower courts on this particular young man's case, the Supreme Court indicated it would not get involved in what it regards as political matters, and hence there will be no constitutional decision on the question. Aren't you jeopardizing both yourself and all the young men whom you ask not to serve?
Well, I think there are two answers to that. First, I have never felt that the Supreme Court of our nation could not reverse itself. After all, courts are responsive to public opinion. Now, I would not stop the process of seeking to gain constitutional validity for a certain valid point of view because the court rendered a particular decision even a year ago. I think you continue, you persist, and the court can reverse itself as it has done in the past. But I think there's an even deeper point, and that is that when you embark upon a course that you know is right and just, you are willing to accept the consequences, and you are willing to accept all of the slings and arrows coming from those who contend that the position is wrong. Now, I know that there's deep confusion, deep frustration, and there are many complexities involved in this war situation. There's no unanimity of opinion. Everybody knows that there is a great deal of conflict. But this does not cause the person of righteous concern to give up. You go on because you feel that you are right, and you accept the penalties, you accept the suffering. And I believe that if we could get in the United States a vast outpouring of young men to say we are not going to fight in this war, we are not going to participate in slaughtering people, murdering people who are merely in the midst of a civil war where they are seeking self-determination, I feel this more than anything else could bring about a change, and it would cause our government to really change its policy.
Are you prepared to go to jail for these beliefs, as aiding and inspiring and abetting violations of the draft laws?
Oh, of course. I don't have any problem at that point. I've been in jail 18 times on racism questions, and I don't have any problem by going to jail for militaristic questions. I think that we are dealing with twin evils here, and they are inextricably bound together. Racism and militarism are both wrong, and I don't think there can be any freedom without justice. I don't think there can be any justice without peace, and I don't think there can be any peace without justice. All of these things are tied together, and by taking a stand against the war and engaging in what may be civil disobedience approaches, I must be willing to face whatever comes, even if it means jailing, and I would take this as just an extension or an expansion of my activities in the civil rights movement.
Have you discussed your position at all with any political leaders, such as Senator Kennedy, for example, or Senator Fulbright, whose position you seem to espouse at any rate?
No, I have not had a chance to talk with either Senator Kennedy or Senator Fulbright. Naturally, I have watched with concern and at points with eager response the statements that they have made and the positions that they've taken on the cessation of the bombings and the arrogance of power on the part of our nation, but I have not had a chance to talk with either of them about it. I do plan to do this. I have a great desire to talk with not only the two senators that you mentioned, but there are several others who are against this war, and I feel that since the whole issue is in the political arena to an extent, that we've got to mobilize as much political support as we can get.
Have you given any thought, Dr. King, to the prospects of a third party or third candidate in 1968, should the war continue along these lines, a so-called peace candidate?
No, I haven't given any thought to that. Some people have talked with me about it. In fact, some have even gone to the point of talking with me about forming such a third force or a third party and running for president. First, I have no presidential desires. I have no desire to engage in partisan politics, so that would almost negate that altogether. I feel, though, that maybe a third force is needed now, and that we are bogged down with two political parties that are both. I feel, though, that maybe a third force is needed now, and that we are bogged down with two political parties that are both moving in the same direction on the war in Vietnam. So I would not oppose a third party. I think it would bring a new dimension to our country that we desperately need. It would not be a winning party the first year. It would not be a party that would have the influence of the Democratic and Republican parties, but I think it could have something of the power of the Liberal Party right here in the state of New York.
Dr. King, you have been accused of taking the Viet Cong position on the Vietnam War, specifically of denying that the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese had any responsibility for the war at all, and that the fault was solely in the hands of the Americans. Do you think that this is, as some people have intimated, playing into the hands of the enemy?
Well, I would certainly say that there is a point in any struggle where the truth must be told, and I feel that the initiative of this war is with the United States, and I feel that the initiative to end the war should also be with the United States. Now, I have no identity with, I do not share the communist position. I made it very clear over and over again that I disagree philosophically with communism, but I feel that people have a right and even a responsibility to choose their own destinies and to shape their own governments. And I would be the first to insist that the National Liberation Front not only have part in negotiations, but that they have a part in the future government of South Vietnam, because they represent a large segment of the people in that blighted country. Now, this does not play into the enemy's hand in the traditional sense where people contend that if you say anything favorable about the enemy and negative about your country, that it destroys the possibility of your particular country being effective. I do feel that it merely puts your country, and I do not take any position other than that of one who loves America. I'm an American, and I love this nation, and I take a position because I feel that unless this problem is solved, we will destroy the soul of our nation. It will further isolate the United States morally and politically from the rest of the world, and above all, it will lead us more to the possibility of the destruction of all mankind. None of these things would I like to see, and therefore I don't feel that it's any damage to the nation as a result of my standing up against the war, nor do I feel that it would lead to any kind of destruction. I think the destruction will come in the failure of our nation to really bring an end to the war.
You have expanded on this concept by accusing the United States of what Senator Fulbright has said is an arrogance of power in other areas of the world, specifically Latin America. And you have indicated that you felt that we were engaging in activities in various countries on behalf of private capitalist corporations. Could you expand on this?
Yes, I think our country, which I must say is the richest, most powerful country in the world, has at points become enamored of its power. I think we do suffer from a kind of pride of power and arrogance of power that can bring the curtain down of the whole of American civilization. We are arrogant in our assertion that we have everything to learn from, everything to teach other nations and nothing to learn from them. We are arrogant in our feeling that we have some divine messianic mission to police the whole world. And I think we are arrogant in our failure to move progressively and forthrightly toward bridging the gulf between the haves and the have-nots of the world. Now, on the specific issue of our failure to really deal with the problem of economic exploitation, or to put it another way, our failure to really deal with the problem of the have-nots of the world, I do feel that we are on the wrong side of a world revolution. I feel that because we have too often identified ourselves with the wealthy and the secure, and we have ignored the poor and the insecure. And if we do not stop the path, or rather, if we do not stop the approach that we are taking, we're going to have Vietnams all over Latin America. We're going to have Vietnams all over Africa and in many other Asian countries. We've got to come to see that we are not here to police the world. We have neither the moral, the physical, or the economic resources to patrol the world. We have the economic resources to revive the world. And if we would see that, I think we would take a new course of action altogether, and that we can be a major force in bringing into being the kind of revolution of values that will be more person-centered than property or profit-centered.
Dr. King, you have suggested that ministers who are able to avoid the draft because of the fact that they are ministers not take that way out, but specifically oppose the Vietnam War and use that as a way of not fighting in a war that you regard as unjust and immoral. Would this apply, for example, to someone like heavyweight champion Cassius Clay?
Yes, it would. Now, Muhammad Ali, better known, I guess, as Cassius Clay, has contended that he is a Muslim minister. He's certainly engaged in many activities, certain preaching activities, which would give him the position of a minister. My feeling is that Cassius Clay, or Muhammad Ali, is being drafted because of his stand against the war in Vietnam and because of other religious and political views. I feel that this is absolutely wrong. I feel that it is an injustice toward him and a perpetuation of a double standard of justice. And I feel that he has a perfect right to contend that he is a conscientious objector, even though he is a Muslim minister, on the basis of the fact that he has not exempted himself from military service.
But Cassius Clay, or Muhammad Ali, as you call him, has not said that he does not want to be drafted because he opposes the Vietnam War. Now, do you think that he ought to come out and make this a specific point in terms of his conscientious objection?
Well, I certainly think he should make that a specific point, but I do think he's made it a specific point. In the early days of his objection to the war, he made it very clear that he objected to the Vietnam War and that he objected to what was being done and what was happening to the Vietnamese people. Now, in recent months, he has not brought that out. He has not stressed that, and I would hope that he will stress that even more, and that his reason for being a conscientious objector is to remain true to certain deep moral commitments that are embedded in his being, so that we don't give the impression at any point that we are just protesting for protesting's sake, that we do not give the impression that we are on a Hate America campaign, but that we are at bottom moving on the fact that America must move to a new level of its own commitment.